In this presentation, I'd like to offer a reinterpretation of the fall narrative in Genesis. I'm going to suggest that the fall narrative is about the rise of self-consciousness in humanity. Interestingly, self-consciousness, the phrase, has a double meaning. Not only does it mean being conscious of yourself, but also self-consciousness is how we describe feeling self-conscious when perhaps we're aware of some sort of moral transgression. So there's a double meaning to the phrase self-consciousness, but both are relevant to the Genesis narrative. I'm offering an evolutionary account of the rise of self-consciousness and moral attitudes in humanity. This account is compatible with both dualism and monism with respect to the mind-body problem, and it's compatible with both theism and pantheism. Let's start with a sort of a materialistic worldview. There is matter and energy, and many understand that matter and energy has evolved over time subject to the laws of nature, and part of that process is the evolution of life. And people who only buy into monism, so the idea that there's only matter and energy, rely on an account in which evolution generates the physical brain, and that is the material seat of consciousness. Now, how matter is the seat of consciousness is a great mystery within the materialist worldview, but I'm offering an account, I hope, that is consistent with monism and materialism as one worldview. But it's also compatible, I claim, with both theism and dualism. Theism, obviously, is the belief that there is a God distinct from the universe. Dualism, in terms of the mind-body problem, is the thesis that there are two realms, two types of substance. Not only is there matter, but there is also a second type of substance, and that is where our consciousness actually exists, the sort of mental realm. So I'm going to try and give an account that is compatible with a materialist account of the mind-body, but also is compatible with various other metaphysical positions, namely dualism with respect to the mind-body, but also compatible with both theism and pantheism. And this analysis can be characterized as within the subdiscipline of the science of religion. Often people think of science and religion as antagonistic, but I don't want to take that attitude. I want to try and understand the world in a way that admits both of scientific and of religious perspectives. And this was a position shared by William James. And to quote William James, one of the duties of the science of religions is to keep religion in connection with the rest of science. We shall do well to seek first of all a way of describing the more, which psychologists may also recognize as the real. And I'm seeking to offer an analysis of the fall narrative that evolutionary biologists, cognitive scientists, and psychologists may recognize as the real. Let me mention some assumptions and some ambiguities. I'm going to assume that humanity evolved from earlier life forms, that self-consciousness is an evolutionary adaptation, and that motivational attitudes, including moral attitudes, are evolutionary adaptations. Motivational attitudes are simply the attitudes that we find ourselves having that motivate us to do things. And the things that they motivate us to do might be general interests, but they might also be recognized as moral imperatives. So that's what I'm assuming. Now, there are some ambiguities with the language that I'll be using. There's ambiguities between the concept of consciousness and self-consciousness. Some people claim that humans are the only animals with self-consciousness, but presumably there might be some more animals that are conscious. I don't want to push those two concepts very hard. I want to just sort of acknowledge the fact that there is some ambiguity between the concepts of consciousness and self-consciousness. There's also some ambiguity with the general concept of motivational attitudes. Again, motivational attitudes are the attitudes that we find ourselves having that motivate us to do things. And one way of understanding that is that you find things good and you want to pursue them. But a subset of those goods are moral goods. I don't want to sort of push too hard on all of those distinctions, but I want to admit that there is some sort of ambiguity in the words that we're using. And finally, self-consciousness as a phrase is ambiguous. As I've mentioned already, there's one sense of being self-conscious is being conscious of yourself. But there's also a moral form of the interpretation of the word self-conscious when you feel yourself self-conscious in a social setting. As I say, I simply want to mention those assumptions and ambiguities before we proceed. But now, I'd like you to consider a question and take the time to think about this question in some detail. What was it like for our ancestors to think about themselves? So I encourage you to sort of pause and think about that question. Modern humans think about themselves in a certain way. But now imagine going back through the evolutionary lineage of humanity. What would their mental lives be like? What would it be for our ancestors to think about themselves? What concepts would they use? How would they conceptualize themselves? At some point in our history, if you buy the general story, there was a point at which we weren't self-conscious. Going back further, presumably there was a time when we weren't conscious. But as those capacities emerged in our evolutionary lineage, what would that be like? Now, imagine telling a story about the emergence of consciousness and morality. Imagine telling that story to yourself or to other people. We share stories all the time, but imagine telling a story about the emergence of consciousness and morality. I'm going to claim that that is what the fall narrative in Genesis is about. So, I assume that there was a time when the evolutionary ancestors of humans were not conscious. Humans are now conscious, so there must have been a transition from non-conscious beings to conscious beings. If you wanted to describe that transition, how would you do it? Well, as I've said, I claim that the fall narrative is one attempt at giving an account of the rise of self-consciousness. I'm going to offer a basic reinterpretation of the fall. Now, this is not the familiar interpretation. I'm not going to give an account in terms of original sin. It's going to be a different account, so I invite you to follow me along as I make this suggestion. Here are some basic points about the story. Humanity is with God in the Garden of Eden before eating of the tree of knowledge of good and evil. Humanity gains knowledge of good and evil, then humanity is no longer with God. This story is about two things: the evolution of self-consciousness and the evolution of the notion of good and evil. And note that the evolution of these two things are related. Now, while morality, or more generally a notion of motivation, has a role to play in my interpretation, it's not the traditional role. As I mentioned, it's not about original sin. But interestingly, it's about the origin of both good and evil. So in a way, it's about original sin, but in a way that we don't appreciate. It's about the origin of the capacity to think in terms of good and evil. So in a sense, it is about original sin, but it's also about original goodness. Let's now go through the Genesis account to remind ourselves of some of the important points. I won't read all of the text. I'll simply read the sections highlighted in blue. So, the Lord God formed man. So God creates Adam. Then God creates the tree of knowledge of good and evil. And out of the ground made the Lord God to grow the tree of knowledge of good and evil. Then God commands Adam not to eat from the tree of knowledge. Eating from the tree of knowledge would result in death. And the Lord God commanded the man, saying, Of every tree of the garden thou mayst freely eat, but of the tree of knowledge of good and evil thou shalt not eat of it. For in the day that thou eatest thereof thou shalt surely die. God creates Eve, and Adam and Eve are not ashamed. It's an important point at this point in the story. The Lord God made he a woman, and they were both naked, the man and his wife, and were not ashamed. So at this point in the story, note, they are with God, they're not ashamed. So in one sense of the term, well, I'm going to claim in both senses of the term, they're not self-conscious. Now the serpent describes the consequences of eating from the tree of knowledge of good and evil. And the serpent said, Ye shall not surely die. For God doth know that in the day ye eat thereof, then your eyes shall be opened, and ye shall be as gods, knowing good and evil. Then Adam and Eve eat from the tree of knowledge. She took of the fruit thereof and did eat, and he did eat. And then at this point, Adam and Eve gained knowledge of good and evil. And the eyes of them both were opened, and they knew they were naked. And they sewed fig leaves together and made themselves aprons. And they heard the voice of the Lord God walking in the garden in the cool of the day. And Adam and his wife hid themselves from the presence of the Lord God amongst the trees of the garden. Of course, God then discovers that they've eaten from the tree of knowledge. And the Lord God called unto Adam and said to him, Where art thou? And he said, I heard thy voice in the garden, and I was afraid, because I was naked, and I hid myself. And he said, Who told thee thou was naked? Hast thou eaten of the tree whereof I commanded that thou shouldst not eat? And then, of course, Adam and Eve leave the Garden of Eden. And the Lord God said, Behold, the man is become as one of us, to know good and evil. And now, lest he put forth his hand and take also of the tree of life, and eat, and live forever, therefore the Lord God sent him forth from the Garden of Eden. A very famous and moving story. But what I want to do is review some of the fundamental points with fresh eyes. Before eating, humanity is with God. After eating, humanity is not with God. Literally, they are expelled from the Garden of Eden. They're walking around in the garden with God, then they're not with God. That is the most fundamental aspect of this story. And the act of eating is associated with a major transition of some kind. Thou shalt surely die. Your eyes shall be opened, and ye shall be as gods, knowing good and evil. And the Lord God said, Behold, the man is become as one of us to know good and evil. These are profound changes in the status of humanity. So here's my basic claim. The fall is an account of the evolution of self-consciousness. What is self-consciousness? Self-consciousness is the conceptualization of oneself as distinct from the rest of reality. This account also involves the evolution of motivational attitudes, including moral attitudes. So, I claim that this account is about literally the coming into being of humanity as we understand ourselves. So it's the sort of the emergence of our sense of self that we currently have. It's the modern conceptualization of self. And that's a pair of self-consciousness and morality. Recall that I'm trying to give an account of the evolution of the brain over time, and at some point in that evolutionary story, we reach self-consciousness and moral attitudes. And perhaps that's what it means to be human. But before we were human, we were earlier forms of our lineage. Perhaps those earlier forms had proto-consciousness, and that evolved into consciousness, and then that evolved into self-consciousness. Equivalently, such beings may have had proto-motivational attitudes, then motivational attitudes, understanding things are good, and then there may have been moral attitudes, so the recognition of moral goods. Perhaps this account, the full narrative, is about becoming human as we understand ourselves. And this is echoed in academic analysis of biblical texts. Here I've taken a quote from the great texts of the Bible, and in that text, recognition is given to both self-consciousness and morality as uniquely human. Quoting from Hastings, man is not only conscious, but also self-conscious. He can turn his mind back in reflection on himself, can apprehend himself, can speak of himself as I. This consciousness of self is an attribute of personality which constitutes a difference, not in degree, but in kind, between the human and the merely animal. No brute has this power. None, however elevated in scale of power, can properly be spoken of as a person. The sanctity that surrounds personality does not attach to it. Hastings also makes mention of the recognition of right and wrong. The great distinction between right and wrong belongs to man alone. An animal may be taught that it is not to do certain things, but it is because these things are contrary to its master's wishes, not because they are wrong. So notice these two concepts of self-consciousness and a moral attitude to life are recognized as uniquely human. So what I'm suggesting is that I'm inviting you to think of this narrative as a narrative about the evolution of self-consciousness and moral motivation. So perhaps the full narrative is an attempt to articulate the transition from consciousness to self-consciousness, from motivational attitudes in general to moral motivational attitudes. Or perhaps the full narrative is more appropriately located before what we might call proto-consciousness and consciousness, or proto-motivational attitudes and fully fledged motivational attitudes. Or perhaps it's better to think of the fall as describing a period of our evolutionary lineage, stretching over a period that begins with proto-consciousness and proto-motivational attitudes and ends with fully fledged self-consciousness and moral attitudes. We'll never know, but my suggestion is that that's a valuable way of interpreting the narrative. So, what is this narrative about? The story is traditionally about original sin, but I don't think it is. So, what is this narrative about? It's about the evolution of two capacities. Firstly, the capacity of being conscious of oneself as a self. Second, the capacity for that self to take a motivational attitude. What do I mean by a motivational attitude? I take it basically as wanting something. There's a lot lurking in the sort of concept, but let's just think of it in terms of being conscious of the fact that you want something. And I take a moral attitude to be a type of motivational attitude. So one can want to do the right thing. I suggest that in order for self-consciousness to be selected for by natural selection, motivational attitudes must be present. Thus, I assume that motivational attitudes must co-evolve with self-consciousness. So why am I linking self-consciousness and motivation? Well, consider how evolution works. In order for some trait to be selected for, it must confer some survival advantage on the organism. So imagine there arises in some proto-human the capacity to think of itself as a self. Would this capacity alone confer a survival advantage? I suggest that it would not. But the capacity for self-consciousness in combination with the capacity to take motivational attitudes would confer a survival advantage, assuming the appropriate motivations. So self-consciousness and motivation evolve together. Let's look at a simple example. Imagine variation across a population of proto-humans. They have consciousness. Let's consider three different possibilities. The first being has consciousness and a suitable motivation. That confers a survival advantage. But consciousness plus no motivation might actually lead to a minor survival disadvantage because consciousness is metabolically costly. It takes a lot of energy to maintain a brain. So unless that brain is acting in a way that furthers the survival chances of the organism, then it's actually a drain. Finally, consider consciousness and an unsuitable motivation. Presumably that would be a survival disadvantage. Let's fill these three examples out a bit more. So imagine a being with consciousness and having an attitude that is pro a full belly. So it wants a full belly. That would lead to a survival advantage. Second being with consciousness but that is indifferent to the fullness of a belly, again, would be a minor disadvantage. Presumably, again, because consciousness is metabolically costly, and if it's not striving for things, then it's just a waste of that metabolic cost. Finally, third example, consciousness plus the motivation to have an empty belly, presumably that's a survival disadvantage. Again, natural selection will act on the variation in a population. Here's these three examples we're considering. And I'm suggesting that natural selection will select for consciousness plus a suitable motivation. That pairing will outcompete the other two pairings. And indeed, if natural selection acts long enough, natural selection would hardwire the appropriate motivations. So, I offer a reinterpretation of the fall narrative. I suggest that we can reinterpret the fall as the co-evolution in humanity of two features, self-consciousness and either the evolution of humanity's capacity to think morally, or more generally, the evolution of humanity's capacity to take motivational attitudes more generally. Now, let me return to the themes of theism and atheism, because this is a narrative that exists within the Bible. So how might my reinterpretation be relevant to both theists and pantheists? Let's consider self-consciousness and God as other. Once self-consciousness has arisen in humanity, how would we perceive our relationship with God? Before self-consciousness, we, in inverted commas, would seem to be not separated from God at all, if we indeed perceived this. Without self-consciousness, we may not have perceived of ourselves as selves. But certainly after self-consciousness, we would seem to be separated from God. And indeed, standard theological positions within theism think of God and individual humans as distinct. So there is a sort of a distance between God and individual humans on a standard theist account. Now, if we lose self-consciousness in death, presumably we no longer have an awareness of being separated from God. And indeed, one could interpret this as consistent with the concept of returning to God, as some theists believe is the case when we go to heaven. So the idea of returning to God is compatible with this idea of losing a certain sense of separateness from God. So on this account, in quite a profound sense, self-consciousness is what separates us from God. Now, as I said, this can be understood from a theistic perspective, but it can also be understood from a pantheistic perspective. Many of you will be familiar with theism, but perhaps not as many of you will be familiar with pantheism. So, what is pantheism? Pantheism assumes that there's a divine unity, and this divine unity includes all that exists. In other words, the totality of existence is God, or put another way, God is the totality of existence. A famous pantheist, Spinoza, used the phrase God and nature, or God or nature, as one way of understanding the totality of the divine unity. Now, in contrast to theism, God is not distinct from the totality of existence, and God is not a person in the way theists assume God is a person. But all people are part of the divine unity. So I think there's a way of interpreting the fall narrative from the perspective of pantheism. Remember, from the perspective of pantheism, everything is simply part of a divine unity. So before eating from the tree, humanity is with God. After eating, humanity is not with God. From a pantheistic perspective, everything is God. So anything that occurs in this story can only be a perception of separation from God. The evolution of self-consciousness is the source of the perception of the separation of humanity from God. And note that the stronger the sense of self, the more profound the perceived separation from God. Of course, recall that pantheists assert a divine unity, so there's no real separation, it's just a perceived separation. And in death, the perception of separation from God is lost. So it's self-consciousness that appears to separate us from God. Now, other pantheists may not agree with the following analysis, but here's my analysis of pantheism and moral attitudes. Before the evolution of self-consciousness, the divine unity does not have what humans would call motivational or moral attitudes. The evolution of self-consciousness with motivational attitudes and or moral attitudes is the origin of these concepts in God. Thus, the explanation of morality relates to natural facts about the evolution of self-consciousness and moral attitudes in humans, and perhaps other self-conscious organisms. So, the fall is about the rise of self-consciousness. Understanding self-consciousness in those two ways, both being conscious for yourself and being self-conscious in a moral sense. So the fall narrative is not straightforwardly about original sin, although, as I've mentioned, it's about the origin of morality. So in a sense, it is about original sin, but not in the way that we traditionally understand it. It's about the origin of morality, or more broadly, the origin of motivational attitudes, together with the evolution of self-consciousness in humanity. It's about the evolution of both self-consciousness and motivational attitudes, because individually they would not have been selected for through natural selection. And that's why eating from the tree of knowledge of good and evil and becoming separated from God are represented in the same narrative. So the move from with God to not with God, i.e. being expelled from the Garden of Eden, and coming to know good and evil are representations of the evolution of self-consciousness and moral attitudes in humanity. Thanks for listening.